I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there with you all in person, but I'm very, very glad to be able to join you again, as I did in 2021, to connect with you all and share some thoughts from my experience as the Australian government's representative to the Catholic Church here at the Vatican in Rome. Before I go any further, I wanted to start by thanking the organisers of the conference, Peter Jones, Head of Catholic Religious Australia, and Father Brian Lucas from Catholic Mission, for the kind invitation to speak today. And I also want to commend the extraordinary dedication of the conference organisers, Danielle, Peter, and all the team there, whose hard work makes this event possible and a great success each time. I also want to acknowledge the representatives of NATSIC and other Indigenous representatives that are here today, as well as the bishops and everyone really who's united here in the desire to stretch out a hand to those in need in Australia and around the world. I'm honoured to be able to speak to you today from my perspective as Australia's ambassador to the Holy See, and particularly on the subject of leading and acting through partnerships. I've had the opportunity in this role over the past 3 years to engage with the many networks of the Catholic Church and to develop a number of partnerships, which I look forward to telling you about today. I should begin by saying that 2023 is a very special year in the relationship between Australia and the Vatican. We're marking 50 years of diplomatic relations. This milestone, which was announced by then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in 1973, opened a new chapter in our history. The decades that follow tell a story of a mature partnership, punctuated by 3 papal visits to Australia, Sydney hosting World Youth Day in 2008, and the canonisation of Australia's first saint, Mary of the Cross MacKillop, in 2010, as well as a number of other occasions and events that we've celebrated over the years. It is no overstatement to say that the decision to establish bilateral relations in 1973 was a real turning point in the way Australia engaged with this influential institution that is the Catholic Church. It was also a decision that can be framed within a wider shift towards a foreign policy that better reflects Australia's interests and its place in the world. That was the rationale 50 years ago, and it's still one that holds today. As our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, said at the National Press Club 2 weeks ago, our foreign policy must be an accurate and authentic reflection of our values and interests, of who we are and what we want. And the Australian government is working to strengthen that important concept. We are delivering on a commitment to promote a First Nations foreign policy, reconciling our past and telling a more accurate story to the world about who we are as a nation. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were this land's first diplomats. And our conviction is that by elevating their voices on the international stage, we can deepen engagement with many of our closest partners, including our Pacific family. The government recently announced the appointment of Australia's inaugural Ambassador for First Nations Peoples, Mr. Justin Mohammed, who is already active in his role, having taken part at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues just a few weeks ago. Ambassador Mohammed, who's a Goran man who has worked for decades in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, social justice and reconciliation, including as CEO for Reconciliation Australia, will work to embed First Nations voices and knowledge into Australia's international priorities, whether on foreign policy or our trade and economic interests. Amplifying the voice of Indigenous people resonates very strongly here at the Vatican. Pope Francis, who recently marked his 10th anniversary as head of the Church, has been a strong champion of Indigenous communities throughout his pontificate. Since his first overseas trip to Brazil, where he met with Indigenous communities from the Amazon rainforest, he has highlighted the need to respect traditional cultures and protect lifestyles that are under threat. The Pope unambiguously summed up his position in July 2016 when he said, I want to be the spokesman for the most profound plea of Indigenous peoples. Let's unite our voices to demand respect for our Indigenous peoples, whose identity and survival is at risk. The Pope has been vocal in denouncing the legacy of forced assimilation. During his emotive trip to Canada last year, the Pope asked for forgiveness over the Church's role in the running of the so-called residential schools, a dark chapter in Canadian history which echoed some of Australia's own experience with the stolen generations. The Pope has also denounced the logic of colonisation, and in fact, only last month, the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, along with the Dicastery for Culture and Education, published a statement rejecting the doctrine of discovery, a series of papal decrees dating from the 15th century, which perpetuated ideas of racial superiority and justified the actions of European colonial powers. The move is nothing short of historic. But above all, Pope Francis is keen to find pathways towards reconciliation, showing a sincere respect and deference for the lifestyles, culture, and traditional knowledge of First Nations around the world. He has arguably done more than any of his predecessors to bring the Church closer to Indigenous communities around the world. Last year, he conceived and commissioned a project entitled Doing Theology from the Peripheries, which looks at ways in which current theological thought should open up to the different experiences and practices of those Catholics who are so distant from the Vatican. In Oceania, this work is being led by Sister Adele Howard, who many of you will probably know, an Australian, who is ensuring the voices of our region are heard in Rome on this important initiative. Together with other project leaders from every continent, they're actively delivering on research that is likely to change the way the Vatican listens to and recognises the important voice of Indigenous peoples in determining the future shape of Catholic worship. Similarly, the Pope opened a few years ago the new Anima Mundi wing of the Vatican Museums, which houses 80,000 objects and works of art from all continents, including a very significant Indigenous Australian collection. The Pope describes Anima Mundi as a living home, literally the soul of the world, and wants it to be a place where dialogue between cultures and religion is promoted. The Australia collection was the first to be open to the public following a policy of reconnection, developing partnerships to culturally reconnect the artefacts and works of art, most of which were sent to the Vatican from Australia in the mid-19th and 20th centuries, with the people and communities who created them. Representatives of the Vatican Museums, working closely with IATSIS and others, visited communities and cultural sites in Western Australia, in the Tiwi Islands, in Queensland and elsewhere to consult, exchange, and learn about the cultural heritage of the objects and using them as a gateway for dialogue and understanding. As Catherine Aidner, an Australian who conducted much of the research and who produced this incredible catalogue of the collection, says, these objects embody cultural networks and partnerships linking Australia to Rome, but also Indigenous spirituality and Christianity. And they are not only on display now in the Vatican Museums with the blessing of the people, but are active in stimulating new ways of thinking about heritage, culture, and the care of our living home. This year, we're planning a series of events to mark Reconciliation Week at the Vatican, and we're very excited to be welcoming to Rome Dr. Marion Rose Ngumer-Baumann, who many of you will know. Her visit will be an opportunity to bring a senior Aboriginal voice to the Vatican, including to meet Pope Francis, to speak about the value of inclusive education, in which she's played a fundamental role, including as the first Aboriginal teacher in the Northern Territory, of Indigenous knowledge and connection to land, including through her concept of Dadiri, and about the role of Indigenous art in building bridges and contributing to reconciliation. And she'll be donating one of the pieces of her artwork to the Vatican museums. We'll also be marking the 50th anniversary of the first Aboriginal liturgy in Australia with a special mass celebrated by Cardinal Arthur Roach, who heads up the Dicastery for Divine Worship here at the Vatican. And we'll also be marking Mabo Day with a lecture by Father Frank Brennan at the Pontifical Gregorian University here in Rome. We will be streaming several of these events, so we hope many of you will be able to join us during that week. Virtually, of course. We will post more information on our website and also through our social media channels. Today, Australia is embarked on an important process through the Voice referendum, where our citizens are being asked to vote on the principle of listening to and recognising our First Nations in the Constitution and establishing a permanent body made up of First Nations representatives to have a voice on issues that matter to them. As Prime Minister Albanese stated last month, the government is doing this not just because it's common courtesy and decency to ask people before you take a decision that will impact them, but because when you reach out and listen to communities, you get better results. And better results is precisely what should drive the partnerships we form, especially if we are serious about combating the great challenges we face as humans, including, for example, climate change. We know that climate change is the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the people in our oceanic region. This is why the Australian government is taking strong action to decarbonise our economy, scale up global action, and develop clean energy supply chains. We are also committing significant additional development assistance to the Pacific, including support for strengthening climate resilience in the region through climate science and renewable energy. But it's not just about money or the provision of resources or expertise. It's about forming partnerships with a willingness to listen. And this is one of the reasons why Australia is now bidding to host the biggest climate change conference, the UN Conference of the Parties in 2026, in partnership with the Pacific, enabling our region to have a voice on the global stage. On this issue, Pope Francis has also led the way, reminding us always to listen to the cry of the earth. But not only, he reminds us that a truly ecological approach must always be a social approach, a social vision. So questions of justice must also be addressed when we're considering environmental issues. Again, listening to the voices on the margins becomes critical. The Pope also highlights the particular connection to land and country for Indigenous communities. For them, he writes in Laudato Si, land is not a commodity, but rather a gift from God and from their ancestors who rest there, a sacred space with which they need to interact if they are to maintain their identity and values. Again, partnerships with First Nations communities are so critical. And Australia is uniquely placed to highlight First Nations knowledge and experience in managing the climate crisis, including through, for example, our Indigenous ranges and land management projects, and First Nations leadership on adaptation action, including through the establishment, for example, of a new Torres Strait Climate Centre of Excellence, which the government is funding. In February this year, I had the opportunity to join the Assembly of Oceania Bishops in Fiji, and I was able to engage with a variety of political, faith-based, and community leaders on the priorities for the region. Unsurprisingly, climate change and its devastating effects on the region's ecosystem was at the top of the agenda. I, along with the bishops and others, were able to witness firsthand the speed with which sea level rises were making vast swathes of Fiji uninhabitable. We visited one small village, for example, where the rising sea levels had taken away half of the land of the village, and the cemetery was now underwater. The visit to Fiji underlined for me the importance of working in partnership with the church in our region, including through our and the government's Pacific Church Partnership Program, which enhances linkages between current and emerging church leaders and provides a forum for exchange and the development of new initiatives, whether that's on labour mobility, humanitarian disasters, or ending violence against women. The gathering in Fiji also served as the continental phase for the Synod on Synodality, facilitated by the presence of Sister Natalie Beccard, who's Undersecretary for the Synod of Bishops and one of the Vatican's most senior female leaders. The synodal process the Catholic Church has embarked on, which is one of the hallmarks of Pope Francis's papacy and is often described as journeying together, is all about listening, dialogue, and partnership. I'm conscious that you'll cover synodality in the next session, so I don't want to say too much to preempt those discussions. But I do want to highlight the fact that Sister Natalie took the time to travel to our region back in February and listen to the testimony of people who are distant from the Vatican's corridors. Voices once so removed from decision-making are now being given an active role in forging the future of the Catholic Church. And it's impossible not to be optimistic, for example, about the Pope's announcement just last week that not just bishops will have full voting rights in the Synod for the first time in the Church's 2,000-year-old history. The process hasn't been without its challenges, as partnerships rarely are. And while synodality is a process of listening, many will rightly expect it to be a pathway for change too. And the challenges are manifold, considering that the most recurring themes emerging from the process that we've been able to observe here in Rome refer to complex issues such as the child sex abuse crisis, women's empowerment and gender equality, and the need to journey together with Indigenous people. To really tackle these issues, the status quo is not an option, and change will be needed. My time at the Vatican over the past 3 years has increasingly underlined the need to think outside the box, to look for new partnerships when we seek to address the immense global challenges we are facing. And this is one area where I think religion has a unique contribution to make. Religion can provide a diagnosis of what ails us and what moves us as humans, and that is of enormous value to our work on the world stage. Religions have also proven to be an indispensable tool for building partnerships. I have witnessed the potential of religions to remove barriers where ideologies have laid them down. Religions have the potential to appeal to us as humans and to capitalize on the wealth that is our diversity. Pope Francis' commitment to interfaith dialogue points very much in this direction. He has recently used his partnerships across Christian denominations to call for an end to the unjust treatment of LGBTI people and to call for peace in conflict-ridden parts of Africa. He has promoted tolerance by working with Muslim leaders in the Middle East. And he gathered 40 religious leaders from around the world back in 2021, alongside scientists and Indigenous representatives, including NATSIC chairperson John Lakoviak, to raise awareness and underline these leaders' commitment to climate action and the protection of our common home. In my role, I have seen that the Pope has a deep conviction in the power of partnerships to achieve humanity's greatest ambitions. And partnerships should be ambitious. They should aim high, and they can only be made stronger when a wide range of perspectives are taken into account. The conference's title, One Heart, Many Voices, could hardly be more pertinent. So with those few reflections, I want to thank you all for listening this morning, and I'm very happy to continue the conversation during the Q&A. Thanks again.